Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laiq Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. We just came from a hard, clean silence. In part 42, we sealed something that sounds simple but changes everything. Undifferentiated phi has 0 internal degrees of freedom. No knobs, no dials, no hidden constants, no private parameters hiding in the basement of reality. Phi is pure capacity, not a recipe, not a list of outcomes, not a cosmic settings menu, just the bare permission that distinctions can be possible. That seal was not poetry, it was a firewall. Because the moment you allow a hidden knob in the ground, you can always explain anything by turning it. And if anything can be explained, nothing can be falsified. So we cleaned the foundation, we removed units, we removed scales, we installed closure as a minimal structure when representation becomes necessary. And then we removed the final temptation, the belief that phi secretly contains the constants of nature. Now we move to part 43, and it is the next pressure point where people smuggle again, this time not by adding constants, but by adding minds. Because once you say phi is the capacity for distinctions, someone will inevitably ask, okay, but how do observers appear? How does reflection appear? How does knowledge appear? How does a system ever refer to itself? How does the universe ever become able to say I? And the trap is this. People try to answer these questions by sneaking in selfhood as a new primitive. They treat self-reference as a special magical feature that must be inserted later, like a soul added to matter. Part 43 says, no. Self-reference is not a later add-on. It is a latent possibility, already contained in what phi is, the capacity for distinction. Because if phi can support distinctions, then, under sufficiently rich patterns, phi can support distinctions about distinctions. And the moment a system can form distinctions about its own distinctions, something new becomes possible. A loop of reference. A mirror inside the mirror. A pattern that points to itself. This is part 43. Latent self-applicability. Core claim. Phi contains the latent possibility that distinction capacity can be applied to itself. Self-reference is not a later addition, but inherent potential. Listener carry. Phi can, in principle, look at itself. Now we have to earn this. Firewalled. Prediction first. Falsifiable. So let's start with the simplest image. Imagine you own a stamp. Not a complicated machine, just a stamp. You press it on paper and it makes a mark. A circle, a name, a symbol. That stamp has one power. It makes a distinction. Before you stamp, the paper is blank. After you stamp, there is a mark and a non-mark. Now here is the crucial question. Can you stamp the stamp? At first it sounds like a joke, but it is exactly the architecture of self-reference. You can stamp the stamp in two ways. 1. You can stamp an image of the stamp, print the stamp on paper, then stamp that printed image. Now the stamp has acted on a representation of itself. 2. Or you can stamp a label on the stamp, put a sticker on it that says stamp. Now the stamp carries a mark about itself. In both cases, the stamp has not gained a soul. It has not gained a mysterious new ingredient. It simply lives in a world where marks can stand for things, including for the stamp itself. That is self-applicability. A distinction-making capacity encountering a structure that allows it to target itself, directly or indirectly, through encoding. Phi is like that stamp at the deepest level. If phi can support differences, then it can support representations of differences. And representations can include representations of the representing system. So self-reference is not imported. It is one of the natural things that becomes possible when distinctions become rich enough to include aboutness. But we must be careful. Part 42 said phi has no internal knobs, so we cannot secretly build self-awareness settings into phi. Part 43 respects Part 42 by saying phi does not contain a pre-installed self. Phi contains the possibility that patterns can become self-referential once there is enough structure for encoding and looping. No hidden soul, no metaphysical upgrade, just the same capacity folding back on itself. Now, to make this sharp, let's build it from the ground up with analogies you can't forget. The mirror that doesn't need magic. Imagine a room with no mirrors. You can still exist in that room. You can still walk, you can still talk, but you cannot see yourself. Now place a mirror in the room. Suddenly, without changing your body, without adding anything to your brain, a new capability appears. You can see yourself. Where did that capability come from? It didn't come from a new particle. It didn't come from a new force. It came from a new loop. Light leaves you, hits the mirror, returns to you. A cycle, a closure. Self-appearance is often just a return path. Part 41 taught us closure produces integers. Part 43 teaches us closure also produces reflexivity. A system becomes self-facing when information can travel a loop and return in a structured way. Now notice, this is already foreshadowed by our earlier seals. We already accepted cyclic structure, closure. We already accepted finite access. Public observables are finite jet. We already accepted public carriers. Information must be gauge clean to be shareable. We already accepted parsimony. No extra primitives before earned. Self-reference in this architecture is not a new primitive. It is what happens when a sufficiently rich carrier network can route signals back into the system's own model-building process. The mirror doesn't invent you. It reveals a pathway that makes you as object visible to you. So part 43 says, phi contains the latent possibility of mirrors, not necessarily physical mirrors, but informational return loops. The recipe that mentions itself. Now imagine a cookbook. Most recipes describe external things. Add salt, heat the oil, stir. But now imagine a very strange recipe that includes a sentence like, now read this recipe again from the top. That one sentence creates a loop. The recipe has become self-applicable. It refers to itself. Does the paper need a mind to do that? No. Self-reference can exist as structure, even without consciousness. This matters because people confuse self-reference with subjective experience. They think if you talk about self-reference, you must be smuggling mind into the foundation. No. Firewalled. Part 43 is not claiming phi contains consciousness. It is claiming phi contains the possibility that structures can refer to themselves. Consciousness, whatever it turns out to be in later episodes, would be a special kind of self-referential stability. But self-reference itself is more primitive than that. It is a loop in encoding. A recipe that tells you to reread is self-referential. A computer program that prints its own source code is self-referential. A sentence like, this sentence is false, is self-referential. These are not mystical, they are structural. So part 43 is saying, because phi is the root of distinction, it can support structures where distinctions apply to distinctions, where encoding includes encoding of the encoder. The simplest engine of self-reference, a name tag. Imagine a child at school. The teacher says, everyone write your name on a sticker and put it on your shirt. Now something curious happens. The child becomes an object that contains a symbol referring to the child. The name tag is not the child's soul. It is an encoding. But it allows others to refer to the child, and it allows the child to learn that they can be referred to. Self-reference often begins as a label. Now abstract this. A system gains the ability to carry a token that stands for this system. That is enough to start the ladder. Self-reference is born when a system can store a representation, the representation can stand for something, the something can be the system itself. Part 43 claims, Phi makes possible because distinctions can be stable patterns. Phi makes possible because patterns can function as carriers. And Phi makes possible because nothing forbids the system from being among the things represented. This is latent self-applicability. The self is not a substance. It is an addressable pattern. Now we need to convert this into a prediction and a falsification that are not vague. Prediction. Prediction. Sufficiently rich Phi patterns will naturally develop self-referential encodings. Not might, by miracle. Naturally, meaning once the system has enough complexity to build internal models and route signals through loops, self-reference is not an exotic special case. It is one of the generic attractors. Why? Because self-reference is useful for stability. A system that can represent itself can correct itself. A system that can model its own state can regulate itself. A system that can detect its own errors can maintain coherence. Even a thermostat is a primitive echo of self-reference. It measures the temperature and uses that information to control itself. It doesn't think, but it closes a loop. Reading, adjustment, new reading. As structures become richer, loops become deeper. Models of the world, models of the model, models of the model's limitations. So the prediction is not minds appear everywhere. It is the encoding of this system inside the system will tend to arise in complex, stable regimes. And we can already see it across scales. In biology, DNA carries information that builds the organism that carries the DNA, circular causation. In brains, neural systems build models that include models of the self. In culture, language describes language, law describes law, science studies science. In technology, compilers compile compilers. Operating systems manage processes that manage operating systems. Self-reference is a recurring theme because it is a route to robustness. Now, to keep this firewalled, we must articulate the falsification clearly. Falsification. Construct a Phi-based system that supports arbitrary distinctions, but is provably incapable of self-reference. This is a strong challenge. It's not, I don't like self-reference. It's show a system with full distinction capacity that cannot, even in principle, encode itself. So what would it mean to be incapable of self-reference in a provable way? It would mean no matter how you encode, no matter what patterns you build, no representation in the system can refer to the system. That is very hard to guarantee, because the moment you can represent anything, the system is one of the things that exists to be represented. To prove incapability, you would need to impose a strict firewall, a ban on diagonalization, a ban on fixed points, a ban on reflection principles, a ban on self-description. But if you impose those bans, you've already limited arbitrary distinctions. You've smuggled constraints that shrink the capacity. That's the key tension. If the system truly supports arbitrary distinctions, it likely supports the distinction, this description describes this system. If it cannot support that, then its distinctions are not arbitrary, they are restricted. So part 43 is a claim about inevitability given generality. If the capacity is broad enough, self-reference is hard to avoid. Now let's walk through this with a story you'll remember. The library with a catalog. Imagine a massive library. The library contains every kind of book: history, poetry, math, manuals. But there is one special book, the catalog. The catalog lists where books are located. Now here is the important question. Does the catalog list itself? If the catalog is a book in the library, then yes, it can. And once it does, a loop appears, a book that contains a reference to itself as a book. If you try to prevent that, you can impose a rule. The catalog is not allowed to include itself. But then the catalog becomes incomplete in a very specific way. It fails to catalog one real book that exists in the library. You can still choose that rule, but now your system has a special exception. And exceptions are extra structure. Part 43 says, phi, as pure capacity, does not come with special exceptions. So when patterns become rich enough to include catalogs, self-inclusion becomes a natural possibility. This is not philosophy for fun. This is the skeleton behind why self-modeling is not an alien addition to reality. It is a possibility that arises from the same roots as information and comparison. Now, another analogy, closer to daily life. The camera that turns around. Imagine a camera. A camera captures images of the world. It can point outward and record. Now rotate the camera and point it at a mirror. The camera records an image of itself. Nothing magical happened to the camera. No new chip was added. No ghost entered the lens. We simply arranged the loop. Camera, mirror, camera. Self-image is a consequence of routing. Likewise, when a system routes information in a loop, when it can build an internal representation of its own operation, it begins to participate in self-reference. Part 43 claims, phi is compatible with such loops because phi is compatible with closure, carriers, and stable distinctions. Now, let's state the core claim again, but even more carefully. Phi does not force self-reference to appear everywhere. Phi does not contain self-reference as an already actual feature in the undifferentiated ground. Phi contains self-reference as a latent potential, because nothing in phi forbids applying distinction to the system that makes distinctions once representation exists. That's why we call it latent self-applicability. Now let's connect it to the whole undifferentiated arc, so the listener always knows where we are. We began with phi as permission for distinction, part 3. We refuse to smuggle existence, time, space, matter, parts 4 through 17. We anchored logic and information as consequences of comparability, parts 18 through 21. We made the ethical demand, claims must be auditable, part 22. We installed windowing, coherence licensing, finite access, estimation discipline, parts 32 through 37. We forced parsimony, part 39. We removed units, part 40. We justified closure as minimal representable structure, part 41. We sealed pure capacity with no parameters, part 42. And now, part 43 says, even with no parameters, even with no units, even with pure silence, the capacity for distinction contains the possibility of reflection. Because reflection is not a new substance, it's a loop in the grammar of distinction. Now, because you asked for this to be prediction first and falsifiable, we should sharpen the test ideas in concrete terms, without pretending we can run the experiments in the void. Here are 3 operational handles that Part 43 offers, each one pointing toward later measurable phenomena when we enter differentiated physics and biology. Handle 1. Self-description should appear at the edge of expressive power. Whenever a system becomes expressive enough to describe a wide class of patterns, it tends to become expressive enough to describe itself. In computing, this shows up as programs that print their own description, compilers that compile compilers, systems that can interpret their own code. In logic, it shows up as languages that can express statements about their own statements. In biology, it shows up as regulatory networks that track their own internal conditions. So the prediction becomes, as phi patterns increase in expressive richness, we should see self-description emerge as a common structural theme, not a rare miracle. Handle 2. Self-reference should correlate with stability and control. Self-reference is dangerous if unmanaged. It can produce paradox and collapse. But when stabilized, it becomes a tool for control. Systems that can represent their own error tend to correct it. Systems that can model their own limits tend to allocate resources better. Systems that can detect "I'm out of my licensed window" tend to avoid catastrophic claims. So the prediction becomes, in any phi realization where stable, long-lived patterns exist, self-referential control loops will be among the strategies that nature finds. Handle 3. If self-reference is impossible, the system is not fully general in its distinctions. This is the falsification pressure. If someone claims, "Here is a fully general distinction system with absolutely no self-reference possible," then the burden is to prove that it still supports arbitrary distinctions. If it cannot express "this representation refers to this system," then the system's representation power is restricted in a very specific way. So either it is not arbitrary or self-reference is possible. That's the fork. Now, let's address the fear people have: paradox. The moment you mention self-reference, someone says, "But self-reference creates contradictions." Sometimes, yes. Unregulated self-reference can create paradox, like a microphone too close to a speaker, feedback squeal. But the existence of feedback doesn't mean sound is impossible. It means you need stability conditions. And this fits perfectly with Holophase firewalls. Self-reference becomes safe only inside licensed windows, with coherence thresholds, with estimation discipline, with gauge-clean carriers. So part 43 is not opening the door to anything goes. It is identifying a latent possibility and warning that it must be regulated later by the same licensing architecture we've been building. Think again of the microphone. A microphone and speaker in the same room create a loop. If the gain is too high, you get a scream. If the gain is controlled, you get useful amplification. If you add filters, you get stable sound. Self-reference is like that. Uncontrolled, paradox, runaway narratives, hallucinated certainty. Controlled, learning, correction, coherence, objectivity. So part 43 also foreshadows something ethical. A civilization that builds self-reference without firewalls becomes a civilization of feedback myths. A civilization that builds self-reference with licensing becomes a civilization of reflection and correction. Now, you also requested a brief mention that the formal backbone is on Zenodo. So here it is, placed naturally. The formal mathematical works behind these concepts can be found on Zenodo by searching for Holophase. Now, to finish part 43 properly, we must answer the "where we're going" piece, because part 43 naturally points to the next seal. Once a system can, in principle, look at itself, the next question is unavoidable. Is phi optional? Could we have reality without this permission of distinction? Could we step outside it? Part 44 will seal the metaphysical necessity. Trying to imagine reality without phi still uses phi, because imagining requires distinction. So part 43 is the doorway to part 44. Part 43 says phi can fold back on itself. Reflection is possible. Part 44 will say you cannot step outside phi. Escape is impossible without using the very thing you're trying to escape. Now I'll end with the carry, clean and memorable, so it lands in the listener's body, not just their head. Here is the carry. Phi can, in principle, look at itself. Meaning, if phi is the permission for distinctions, then it also permits distinctions about distinctions. And once patterns are rich enough to encode and route information in loops, self-reference is not a foreign substance added later. It is a latent possibility already present in the ground scan. Not a soul inserted, not a magic spark imported, just the grammar folding back into a mirror. And the firewall remains. We will not claim self-reference is everywhere. We will not claim it is free from paradox. We will not claim it is consciousness. We claim something narrower, stronger, testable. If a phi realization supports sufficiently rich distinctions, self-referential encodings will naturally arise. And we dare the falsification. Show a phi-based system that supports arbitrary distinctions, but is provably incapable of self-reference. If you can, this seal breaks. If you cannot, the mirror was always possible. Listener carry forward. Phi can, in principle, look at itself.